established working group on fair trade. Welcome to all of you. I am more than happy to welcome on behalf of all of you our eminent guests and speakers. Pierre Newson, who is the director of the UN Reform and Special Advisor at the Hammarskjöld Foundation. Pierre was serving previously or was the head of the United Nations Resident Coordinators Office in Kenya. He has an extensive civil service career in Swedish international development and has held senior management positions in policy programs and coordination at bilateral, regional, and international level. We will have the privilege to listen to our friend and President of Honor, Juli Minoves, the longest serving foreign minister of Andorre, the diplomat of Andorre and of Elhaité. Juli served his country in many ambassadorial posts, including to United Nations, United States of America, UK, Spain, and the World Trade Organization. He is one of the signatories of the Rome Statute that founded the International Criminal Court. He is my predecessor as president of Liberal International and actually our president of honor. Dear friend, all of us are very concerned about the discussions and the output of the UN75th anniversary and dialogue. More than ever, the theme of the celebration of this anniversary, the future we want, the UN we need, reaffirming our collective commitment to multilateralism must resonate in every human conscience with a sense of urgency. As you know, Liberal International has always advocated for strengthening dialogue and facilitating pragmatic convergence on key global governance issues and on the key issues in general between actors. We have always called for more international cooperation, more multilateralism, especially during crises. And this pandemic of COVID-19, which has crippled the world with sanitary, economic, and social devastations, is a very good example on how dependent we are on our interdependence. It's why more than ever, we want our liberal voice to be heard. The world, dear colleagues, has changed. In many places, it's turning dramatically illiberal. Threats on human rights, rule of law, democracy, freedom, peace are increasing. And many of the organizations and institutions that make up the very basis of the liberal world order are paralyzed and questioned, threatening human achievements since the Second World War. Multilateralism is indeed in a crisis today. But there is a consensus. There is a consensus that the speed of change in our world, the growing complexity of governance, the emergence of mega threats like climate change, terrorism, migration, pandemics, etc., and the need to secure sustainable growth requires a rethinking of our global institutional architecture. The 24th anniversary of the UN, which marks the 24th of October 2020, which marks the 75th anniversary of the UN, constitutes a chance for civil society to push for improved world governance, to push for more international cooperation, more multilateralism. Beyond the anniversary itself, 2020 will be a juncture of several multi-year reviews of treaties and +5 conferences on topics as varied as the Women, Peace and Security Agenda, Climate Change and the Paris Agreement, the Human Rights Treaty bodies, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, and the SDGs. The world has changed, and we are wondering if the institutional framework of the UN is still adapted. According to President Trump, this is a cost-efficient organization, too often not focusing, and those are his words, too often not focusing on results, but on bureaucracy and process. Even worse, President Trump thinks that right now, the UN is just a club for people to get together, talk, and have good time. And I'm really wondering to what extent President Trump is saying true. What kind of reform should we wait for through this dialogue and anniversary? What UN do we need really to tackle the challenges of this century? How to build more efficient, more transparent, less bureaucratic, less business as usual, like Guterres, the former secretary of the UN, used to say, less business as usual UN. Dear Pierre and dear Julie, I'm sure and have no doubt that you will bring answers to such questions and answers to how we could imagine UN in 2050 and 2045. This is the deadline. So for each of you, you have 10 minutes. And I will be very happy to listen to you with all of us. And please note that this first session is recorded. And dear Pierre, welcome to this discussion of Liberal International. And you have the floor for 10 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. This is Per Knutsson of the Dag Hammarskjöld Foundation. And special thanks to Astrid Thors, who made it possible for me to be with you today. 10 minutes on UN reform to position you. I was asked to bring. It's a real challenge, but I'll do my level best, and you will do the intelligent thinking thereafter. So let me start by just bringing out some arguments that are in favor of multilateralism today and before the reform started. The world has never been richer. Proliferation of engaged member states and development partners have never been more diverse. Never have we had a young generation as aware of sustainable development as we have today. And despite the challenges, world leaders have taken two of the most significant global agendas of our time, the Agenda 2030 and on the SDGs and the United Frameworks on the Convention on Climate Change with 197 parties. So the question then remains, so if these are arguments among others in favor of multilateralism, what is the need for reform? Well, I would say and bring to, for the sake of discussion, that one big reason is that along positive arguments for multilateralism, there has also been a growing doubt whether our multilateral institutions, with the UN as our greatest one, are capable of adapting fast enough to a rapidly changing world and the requirements that a global agenda needs to have to achieve something like the Agenda 2030. And this is underpinning the arguments for a UN fit for purpose. So from this line of thinking then, what are the main building stones? And you will have to unpack and discuss UN reform in view of strategic visioning, but I will try to give you the foundations because that was what I was asked to do. There are three interlinked tracks here. Some people say that what is the difference with this reform against other reforms? Or some, when I was in heading the resident coordinator's office in Kenya, some agencies said, this will blow over, we've seen reforms come and go. But this is actually the first reform ever to take a complete grip on the organization. And as you know, the UN, unlike corporate with one board and several departments, have developed with the help of member states into a multitude of close to 100 organizations. So the UN reform agenda has three levels that are interlinked. The development system level, which is aiming at improving the overall UN approach to the 2030 agenda through a more coherent leadership, the resident coordinated system, a new generation of UN country teams that are not just following their own mandates, but contributing to a joint plan, and a new generation of corporate strategy, which used to be called the UNDAF, the United Nations Development Assistance Framework, and now is called the UN Sustainable Development Assistance, the Cooperation Framework. Short, we can just call it the Cooperation Framework. So one leadership, a more coherent one, a UN country team which brings assets together, and then one strategy responding to development priorities of countries, regions, and global standards. And then secondly, the peace and security architecture, where the UN now needs to break silos and integrate peace with humanitarian and the development nexus, so that we can, the UN wants to shift the focus from mitigation and peace building over to prevention. And we know that prevention is 3 times cheaper than mitigating the consequences of war or conflict. And thirdly, this is the management pillar of the reform. And this is a huge challenge, because since you have separate boards in the UN, streamlining operational processes, making functions work for several agencies, adapting UN country teams to the needs of a country, and not just putting, as of now, 17 agencies on average, regardless which country context you are. Those are huge management decisions that are not necessarily taken in the same room, but we need to take those decisions, the Secretary General says, in order to get the efficiency gains so that we can invest further in the development and the peace building agenda. Now, looking at the big picture of global public goods, considering COVID pandemic, but going beyond, what are the system-wide UN capabilities that we need for the world we want? If we unpack these 3 dimensions of the reform, I have picked out a few to give you examples of opportunities where the unique mandate and the unique brokering and convening of the UN can add value for us in the future. At the development system level, I mentioned the joint sustainable cooperation frameworks. Now, in the past, each UN agencies have been going out shopping for their mandates. Now it's obligatory that in any country, there should be only one strategic framework. And that framework is supposed to bring together global standards, values, and capacities responding to national priorities. So the UN needs to be much more coherently guided where each country puts its priority, but not shying away from the standards and values of the UN Charter. So if we come around these strategies and we invest at a higher level in these strategies, we reduce fragmentation and we can leverage development. The next one I've picked is expanding partnerships and innovation. And this is really going back to the Addis Ababa agenda, action agenda, saying that in a broadening of the aid effectiveness perspective, going to the development effectiveness perspective, we need to bring in civil society and the private sector in co-creating the new ideas that would bring development to scale. And there are new examples within UN strategies and new country teams where this is happening. I will come back to that, but investing in expanded partnership, development data, and diversification of financing tools for development needs to be integrated in the new cooperation framework. And here you as players have opportunities to link up and insert creative capital there. On the peace and security agenda, it is going for what is called the triple nexus. The world wakes up to financing peace when people are dying, while we know prevention is 3 times cheaper. We need to be concretely sharing analysis between humanitarian development and security capacity. And partners and UN member states need to follow suit and not argue for piecemeal project interventions. We need to bring together the local ownership and leadership that can integrate these 3 perspectives in more comprehensive responses. And that's part of the reform. And lastly, on the management reform, I think I mentioned that on average, any UN country management team in any country in the world is by average 17 agencies. And they are there because member states and the agencies themselves believe that they should be present in every country. The reform says we need to tailor UN country team compositions to the needs, so that perhaps you have some country teams in the future that are indeed more than 17 agencies, but in some countries you may have 4 agencies with experts inserted in them from other teams. Let me finalize by unpacking this further. Now, I have been talking about UN reform as the Secretary General's 3 streams. But it's very important to remember that this UN reform is the member states' reform, the 193 member states of the UN, and therefore it can only be co-created if UN member states and partners, we who partner with the UN from different perspectives, also acknowledge that we need to change the behavior, culture, and approach. So let me just give you some example of where we can be consistent to advance the reform and have a more effective UN. Respecting the RC leadership means that we don't do deals automatically with individual agencies, but we ask to engage in a collective conversation on strategic policy collaboration and financing with the whole senior management team in a country. going clockwise, respecting and advancing the UN funding compact commitments means subsequently that we refrain from piecemeal funding just to cherry pick, but we share analysis on the larger strategy, and we invest and instead demand reporting on our contribution to more predictable funding. This is crucial, because if we don't optimize resources, we will waste resources. And even with the limited resources we have now, which needs to be increased, we can still do more if we are coordinated better. Knowing that the coherent UN strategies at the country level has to advance the so-called UN strategic programming principles of leaving no one behind, going to the populations furthest behind first. It has to integrate and focus on gender equality. It has to advance and accelerate human rights compliance. It has to bring together sustainable peace building, not as a plaster or a patchwork, but as socio-economic transformation with stakeholders at work, and it has to address climate, environmental sustainability. Knowing these principles, we as partners of the UN, we know where we can demand accountability from the UN, but we know also how we can contribute with our competences and added value to the UN. I mentioned the private sector and the Addis agenda. So partnering for innovation of methodology includes development data, diversifying financial tools, and improving policy. Sometimes the UN should not do the project. It should convince the stakeholders to move development into scales. And by convening government with private sector and drawing on global resources in financing, we can use new type of bonds for social protection rather than bringing the food in sacks, if I put it a bit crudely. Then we should also know that part of the UN reform is to demand better reporting, and the UN has committed something called the UN Info. The UN Info is supposed to go live this year with live data on all countries' achievements. So by acknowledging this and by requesting from the UN how it reports and on what it reports, and also inquiring to what extent your contributions are made visible in the data, we can contribute to integrated and coordinated approaches with still visibility for the input we make. And lastly, and not least relevant for you, the coordinated approach on global public goods needs also to increasingly connect the institutional fabric of knowledge, policy, politics into these more coordinated strategies, so that we get the best of thinking into the analysis and the follow-up of results. I will stop there and just reiterating that when the General Assembly opens this year addressing, will we make the UN the resource we need for the world we want, that will largely benefit on the type of discussion that you have and that member states have and other partners have. Thank you so much.
Pierre, for your valuable presentation, I will say instead of private sector, the implication of the non-state actor, including NGOs, non-governmental organizations, local collectivities, all the non-state actors can play a major role to leverage and to make the programs of the UN more efficient and more palpable, more touching, rich, word rich and reaching people. So thank you for your presentation. I will give the floor to Juli, our President of Honor. Juli, you have the floor.
Thank you, Madam President. Thank you, Hakima. I wonder whether Michaela, I could put my PowerPoint on the screen. Basically, what I did when I received this commission is I went to look at the documents that both from our side, from the side of Liberal International and from the United Nations, tell us a little bit of what's to come and whether we have any responses to that. And actually, not surprisingly, I did find some responses in the Liberal Manifesto of 2017, the Andorra Liberal Manifesto. Now, if you may go to the second slide, please. One of the things that I found is that the evolving UN agenda and Allies Oxford and Andorra manifestos are intertwined. The Oxford Manifesto of 1947 precedes the Universal Declaration of Human Rights by 1 year and is anchored in the same values and objectives. The Andorra Liberal Manifesto of 2017 and the UN Declaration on the commemoration of the 75th anniversary of the UN, to be adopted this month of September, echo each other in many ways. And liberals are, from the founding of LI, firm believers in the essential benefits of multilateralism. Next screen, please. Now, there's some proof in that, and this is in your screen. You see something I lifted out of our 2017 Andorra Liberal Manifesto. In one, I think it's number 10 of our commitments, we say strengthen international peace and cooperation. Today's globalized world community is interconnected, intertwined, and integrated through technological, social, and economic cooperation. Nevertheless, conflicts over territory, resources, government, ethnicity, religion, and ideology arise, and old feuds re-emerge. For liberals, the preservation or development of peaceful, respectful relations between communities instead of the use of illegal, aggressive force remains the basis for any civilized resolution of conflict. International relations must follow the flow as laid down in international conventions and treaties. International institutions, courts, and arbitration mechanisms need to be strengthened, and while in addition to international diplomacy, physical force may be necessary to maintain the authority and rulings of these international institutions, it is vital that all parties comply with their rulings and decisions and adhere to the force of law rather than the law of force. Liberals want to see a peaceful world. 70 years ago, that was in 2017, we came together after two terrible global conflicts to build liberal democratic internationalism through our political cooperation and Liberal International, and also through the development of international structures of cooperation, such as the United Nations, the Bretton Woods institutions, structures of international law guided by the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the European Union, and in later decades through structures of regional cooperation in Asia, Africa, and the Americas. It is also why we strive to be the catalyst for international disarmament and frontrunners in curbing the global spread of weapons. We know that peace processes and community development must include all the groups in a society, etc., etc. Please, the next screen. Now, I was reading this part of the International Liberal Manifesto, but also in the beginning of the manifesto, it says the best response of liberalism to new rising threats is to promote equality of opportunity for all, strengthen liberal institutions and the rule of law across the globe, promote general and civic education, healthcare, free and fair trade, and sustainable opportunities for every human being, and to cultivate responsibility and accountability across all borders. We liberals believe in human progress based on new knowledge, gained and applied as locally as possible through deliberation, cooperation, and learning in the arenas of democracy, education, and research, the market economy, and civil society. Now, let's just look at this for 1 second. If we read, and we will see it in just a moment, the 75th anniversary resolution declaration of the United Nations, the one that the heads of state and government will adopt in just a few days, you know, the responses to a lot of the issues that we're seeing are already here. Equality of opportunity answers all the issues about rising inequality. And there's a lot of rising inequality. Now, I will tell you at the end of this very short presentation where I think there's a lot of rising inequality. And then the rule of law across the globe, promote general and civic education, healthcare. So education and healthcare were the core of the message we gave in 2017, our current manifesto, basically, and that proves to be so important for the future. For the present, with this healthcare scare, the COVID-19 crisis, we see why we placed healthcare also at the center of our message. At the time, it was a lot of discussion, and we thought, are we going into issues? No, I think we saw clearly the future, and we are answering in a creative way, and we give the right answers for what is to come. The next screen, please. Now, indications where the UN is heading. We have two major indications. The 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, adopted by the United Nations General Assembly in 2015, which has 17 goals, and the upcoming declaration on the commemoration of the 75th anniversary of the United Nations. Next screen, please. So these are the 17 goals. I'm sorry that they're very, very little, but I will just, you probably know them all. By now, it's been 5 years. And poverty, of course, and hunger, ensure healthy lives, ensure inclusive and equality education. It's basically a lot of the things we also found in the Liberal Manifesto. But number 13, and this is probably very dear to the heart of all of us, and to Hakima, the president particularly, take urgent action to combat climate change and its impacts. And there's a little asterisk that says, acknowledging that the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change is the primary international intergovernmental forum for negotiating the global response to climate change. So climate change, a big, big goal. Buried here is number 13, but probably I would argue, and we would argue, that it's one of the most, if not the most important one. Next screen, please. Now, the declaration, the one that is just a draft, but that will be adopted in just a few days, this 75 commemoration declaration. Now, it has a number of points. Very quickly, we will leave no one behind. It says, the decade that's coming, the declaration says, is the most critical of our generation. Cooperation between the UN and international financial institutions is needed. Human rights treaties need to be applied fully. We will protect our planet. Paris Agreement, 2030 Agenda, environmental threats and climate-related challenges, drought, desertification, water, fires. We see all these fires in California these days. Sea level rise, depletion of oceans. This is happening right now, and it's going to happen with more urgency in the future, in the very near future. We'll promote peace and prevent conflicts. Charter of International Law, arms control, non-proliferation, and disarmament. We will abide by international law and ensure justice. We will place women and girls at the center. We will build trust. There's the acknowledgement that growing inequality leads to xenophobia, racism, intolerance, hate speech, and disinformation. We will improve digital cooperation with new technologies. We will upgrade the United Nations, the reforms that our colleague was just talking about, this need for reform, and I will have a little word about that in a moment. We will ensure sustainable financing. States will pay in time, transparency and accountability, plus the Addis Ababa Action Agenda on financing for development. We will boost partnerships, regional organizations, NGOs, civil society, private sector, academia, parliamentarians. Here we enter, particularly because it's one of the goals of the declaration, and we are a particularly special, I think, important NGO. So we need to devise a strategy for Liberal International, how to engage with this particular goal of the declaration. We will listen to and work with youth, meaningful engagement. It's about time You know, we've been trying. We had already in the Copenhagen process in 1994, we already included something of dialogue between generations, etc., etc. But I feel that sometimes we don't listen enough. We will be prepared. Now, this is an acknowledgement by the United Nations that they were caught, we were caught, all of us caught off guard by the COVID-19 pandemic and what to do about that, right? So the networks and the reinforcement of networks for health, very important as well. Next screen, please. Now, let me just say something which echoes what my predecessor speaker said, the importance of member states' commitment. The member states, particularly the P5, the permanent five, the 5 permanent members of the Security Council, and all the other major contributors must be fully committed. The United Nations is blamed for a lot of evils in this world, but in fact, the United Nations also, you know, complimented for a lot of great achievements. But we hear a lot of criticism of the UN. But the UN is a structure of 1945. It is a structure that reflects the power that sovereign states have, and particularly the power within the system of the winners of World War II have. And those winners who have a veto power have a particular responsibility in making and pushing for these goals. If they do it collectively, some of these things will happen, and in a major way, in a very good way. If they don't, we will see again, you know, some reforms that were pushed 25 years ago. I was at the 50th anniversary of the UN in San Francisco, by the way. We celebrated with great fanfare. We cannot do that right now, but we did in 1995. And a lot of these things I'm hearing now, I heard back then. Small states, if they join forces, have a strong voice. Now, I participated, Hakima said, in the creation of the ICC in 1998 through the Rome Conference, and I saw there how if they unite forces, the majority of those states that are under 10 million inhabitants at the UN and some vulnerable states or whatever, they can do a lot as well. So we need the P5 and the major contributors. We need also the small states to work together. It's very hard to reform the structure of the UN, and particularly the Security Council. I already found again a goal to reform the Security Council. Good luck with that, because, and maybe I'm wrong, I hope I'm wrong, but I wasn't wrong when I was saying that. I once had an ambassador for a very important country whose goal was to enter the Security Council and on a permanent basis in a big push that they did several years ago. And I said, I don't see it happening, because how are the ones who have a veto going to relinquish it? And you're going to increase the permanent members of the Security Council without a veto. And if you increase the veto, it's going to be unworkable. It's already relatively unworkable sometimes today. So I don't see how a reform can happen of the Security Council. I think we have the institutions that we have. We're very lucky that we have them. We're very lucky that they develop. We have to work with what we have and reform what we can. But some reforms, I think, are going to be more difficult than others. Evolving role of the right of veto in the Security Council, and that is something maybe for another discussion, but I think it's important to talk about. If we can really reform the Security Council per se, maybe we can talk, and maybe the P5 could agree to some way of working around the veto that would be more productive sometimes than what we have right now. I mean, there are not a lot of active vetoes because, you know, everything comes before. When there's a threat of a veto, it's as good as a veto itself, right? Next screen, please. Now, I do believe, and I'm convinced from my experience at the UN and from what I've been seeing these past few years, and from, of course, the influence that Hakima has had on me, but for many, many issues, that climate change is the issue. Because in a few years, even this pandemic that we're suffering now, whatever will seem, you know, quite minor compared to the disasters that climate change is bringing. And I am positive. I want to be positive. It's true the Earth has never been richer, whatever, although it's very, we can talk about that because the numbers, the way I see them, have been really pushed up in terms of richness or whatever by China. And a lot of other countries have not been so successful by globalization, but I'll say that in a moment. But the main issue is going to be climate change. All these forests, you know, burning, all these, like, you know, oceans, like, you know, rising, all these things. This is going to be a major mayhem for the world. And I think at the same time, like in other crises, like in the 20th century, like World War II and World War I, we will see a maybe, and I'm hopeful there, where we will see that this major change, this major climate change and crisis will bring about a new wave of multilateralism. And that's what I hope for, and that's where we need to work. And human beings, unfortunately, don't react too much on warnings. They react more on after the fact. But the fact is almost on us on this. The political, economic, and security issues created by climate change will be of such magnitude that the necessity for multilateralism will be, in my opinion, unavoidable. The UN at 100 might be an organization in real transformation mode by necessity. Now, next screen, two last reflections that go beyond the UN, but within the UN, about economic and political globalization. Now, we have seen opposing interpretations of globalization in the late 20th century and the early 21st century. Economic globalization and political globalization deserve attention. Now, the economic benefits of globalization are not evenly distributed. China is among the winners within the developing world. If you look at the numbers, yes, there's been a lot of increase of richness and whatever everywhere, but China has been a big part of that in absolute terms and in relative terms. Now, unskilled workers in the industrializing developed nations are among some of the losers. And they actually, in some places, they fuel protectionist political discourses, which in a way, rise with populist politicians that want to use them, even in very advanced democracies. In a globalized world, liberal democracy has two main competitors as ideal types of political regimes. Chinese, I think, in my opinion, maybe there are more, but Chinese market-oriented authoritarianism and Russian-Turkish style illiberalism. We need to think about that within Liberal International. How does that go within what's going to happen there next in terms of internationalism? And then another reflection on the role of the state. Now, the state still seems to have a central role to fight effectively against climate change and the destruction of the environment. How does that impact what the UN can do? Because it is a world of states. Let's remember that. Yes, we have internationalism, we have a lot of instruments, but mostly it's the state that will have, in each sovereign state will have to come to the realization that those are its first objectives, those that are mentioned in the declaration of the 75th anniversary of the UN. And finally, my last screen, please, Michaela. In this globalized world, is a new economy possible? And does economic innovation and growth come hand in hand with liberal democracy and human rights? Now, I was reading a kind of report that has been written with the help of some countries. There was the UAE and others on the UN75 site, in which they talk of many opportunities as we come out of COVID-19 in the exabyte economy, the well-being economy, the net zero economy, the circular economy, the biogrowth economy, the experience economy. So basically creating out of the necessity of climate change and new technologies, a kind of new economy, and being very upbeat about it and saying that states need to actually focus on that. Now, this is very modern, and this is actually, very encouraging. You read this and you think, yes, let's go for that, every country. And, maybe a country like Andorra could have opportunities there as well as an Andorran, I think. But modernity used to be, and I leave you with that final reflection, related to liberal democracy and an open, innovative economy. Is it still that? And what's the role of the UN in all of this? And the role also of the, to me, quite disappointing work sometimes of the Human Rights Council. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Julie, for this brilliant presentation. And I don't want to be a pessimist, but I'm wondering how we can reach the implementation of the Paris Agreement and succeed in fighting climate change with one of the biggest nations, which is the United States, withdrawing from the Paris Agreement. And this had a very bad influence on many big emitter countries like China, for example, like Russia. Russia still in the Paris Agreement, but is doing nothing to tackle and to implement what Paris Agreement is calling for. And I completely agree with you that the challenge of this century will be climate change, with all its consequences on human dignity, on human rights, on human dignity in general, and will exacerbate many phenomena like the one of migration, poverty, etc. I always said when I was high-level champion of the UN that we will not reach the SDGs if we don't have the political will to implement really and effectively the Paris Agreement. But yeah, you know, if you listen to the countries of the southern countries, the one who are saying that they are impacted by the pollution of the north, you will understand that even the funding is not available like we seem to say in many documents. Let's talk about, for example, the aid for development. This aid for development is not given to the countries. The climate change fund or promises of the $100 billion per year are not still there, and unfortunately this year we couldn't have the party convention in UK, but I hope that next year we will be able to organize the COP26, which was planned in UK this year. And 2020 was a very, very important appointment for all the nations, because that was the year of the beginning of the implementation of the Paris Agreement. And I'm really, I would say, categoric. If there is no Paris Agreement implementation, there will be no SDGs goals achievement. So I understand that from Pierre presentation that the UN has now a strategy to reform, and I agree with a lot of what Pierre says concerning the coordination of the agencies of the program, the implementation of the local politicians, but also people locally. And but I'm still I was always thinking that we can optimize the managerial way of the UN, because I think that many agendas are coming together and there are many institutions, not enough coordination. Just if you look at the Paris Agreement conventions and all the bodies who are related to this convention, if you look at the SDGs, if you look at the Sunday conventions, if you look at the biodiversity conventions, all the institutions representing the UN, the UNEP, the UN for this, for that, etc. So I think that in terms of efficiency, we can do more. But our objective as a civil society is, yes, a less bureaucratic UN and more efficient, but also a UN which can achieve the goals of the Paris Agreement, the goals of the SDGs, and which can make and ensure the peace and security worldwide, and make sure that all the nations are respectful of rule of laws and democracy, etc. This is our aim, and it's why I think that as Liberal International we should be vocal, and we should have the opportunity to be more vocal and to be more impactful on what UN is planning. And last point is the Security Council, and I think that this is one of the biggest reform I'm personally waiting for from this UN 75th anniversary. As you say, Julie, I think that it will not be an easy task, and we are facing the same problem like with the Paris Agreement, with the withdrawal of United States, and the same in the Security Council with all those powerful nations who are making their vetoes each time there is a decision to be taken. So I think those are the challenges, and I would like to come back to Pierre and ask Pierre, what do you think Liberal International should do to be more vocal and to be heard during this 75th anniversary of the UN? Pierre?
Thank you, Madam President. That's an extremely difficult question, but I think what I believe in when it comes to UN reform, and which I saw in practical terms between the UN, civil society, and the politicians and the stakeholders in Kenya, is that the reform helps us to prioritize what should be the driving force for joint action. And it is twofold. So on the one hand, it is national development priorities coming together with global standards and values. And those two streams of analysis need to come together in one strategy of the UN, not in 21 agency strategies. So as a political player, I believe that you are a potential safeguarder and advocate for both the global policy compliance at the local level, as much as you can hold UN accountable for acknowledging local development priorities and local development actors. Our biggest problem, I think, is that we are all the UN when we are in New York, but then when we get into the Nairobis or into Mali or to Ecuador, we are raising our Swedish flag and our Danish flag and so forth. And it's the same taxpayers' money and it's our own ambition. So I believe that the UN reform could improve the situation and go around that by if we actually focus our thoughts and resources around these national strategies for development. And my second and last point is, what will it take for us to change our behavior? And I really love the acronym, you know, if you think education is expensive, try ignorant. So what I experienced in Kenya was, you know, the willingness of politicians to invest in highly marginalized areas, not just with humanitarian aid, but for looking at socio-cultural transformation for sustainable peace building in border areas, was the threat of radicalization. And if you as a liberal movement are being able to bring out the youth component, not as a threat to the world, but as a force of inclusion, and that we are able to unpack that, you can both promote global policy advancement, but in a practical way through coherent strategies at the local level. So thank you for allowing me to respond.
Thank you, Pierre. Thank you for your answers and thank you for your presentation. I will maybe stop here and see if there is any question from the floor and from the participants. Karl, Astrid, do you want to have the floor? Any question from your side?
Well, I think one thing, of course, struck me very much in the presentations, and that was Juli's disappointment with the Human Rights Council, and I think we all can agree about that. But maybe we continue the debate during the breakout session. But when we think about the question, I would like to put to Per and to Juli is now. Some people are talking about, let's say, that the growing financial influence of China and Chinese values inside the United Nations. Is there any evidence that China is by financing some sort of programs getting influence, and are they abiding by the reform principles? Because as Per has outlined, I would say that this country approach, this coherent country approach, would help diffuse such influence. But is there any? We see that such influence is taking place outside the UN system, but is it taking place also inside the UN system? Because that, as Juli was so well arguing, we have the threat of let's say different kinds of models that do not exactly adhere to the principles as we see of the United Nations, like the rule of law, democracy, and respect for human rights, as we see it. And will those non-adherence slip into the UN system through financing by China?
Pierre?
Sorry for coming back, so I would love to hear Juli on that one. I would put it this way. The UN is a reflection of its member states. It's the funding base and it's the base for strategy making. So in terms of policy influence and in terms of financing, of course, the superpowers are very important for the UN. And regardless of color of the flag, they have always also tried to be represented in accordance of their perception of their size in the world. So, of course, you have attraction, and you have had attraction since the inception of the UN between organizational accountability to a charter and then accountability to your funders. And that's really a challenge. So I would say, unless personal relationship or national relationship will guide an organization, what are the principles that should guide an organization? And this is where the UN reform and the Secretary General is asking member states to not be, to advance the funding compact, to go beyond core funding from the present levels of 20%, having to go with a hat in hand for the remaining 80%. It makes the organization vulnerable to fragmentation and also for long-term strategic planning. So you have to, we have to, as friend of a collective multilateral agenda, if people respected these principles of non-partisan and long-term funding, we would reduce the risk element of funding connected to certain agendas. Thank you.
Thank you, Pierre. Julie, do you want to add something?
Yes, well, we have to remember also the founding principles of the UN. Yes, there's the Human Rights Declaration, Universal Declaration of 1948, but the founding of the UN in 1945 is, and then later its development throughout the Cold War, was not just about democracy and whatnot. It was about decolonization. It was about many other issues, and some of the principles of international law, like non-interference, right, are very highly guarded by some countries and will continue to be highly guarded. I think China's use of the UN is going to be is selective. It wants to make sure that some principles like non-interference are as strong, if not as some other principles of human rights and whatnot. And we saw that at the Human Rights Council in just 2 or 3 months ago, when what was going on in Hong Kong was actually the object of debate at the Human Rights Council. And Astrid, you might develop more on that, but clearly quite a number of countries actually went to the support of China and reiterating the non-interference within the borders of China, and that the internal matters of China are internal matters, no matter what's going on, whether the law, that security law for Hong Kong, or other matters that are happening in China, like the Uyghur, etc. Right? So that was very clear. The Human Rights Council, a lot of member states of the United Nations from different continents, were very supportive of the Chinese position of non-interference and things that are happening in Hong Kong or with the Uyghurs being matters internal to China. And how is this possible? Well, on the one side, of course, autocrats help autocrats, or authoritarians, tend to help each other. But the other thing is also money. There's a lot of investment for development, if not at the UN, yes, on individual countries in Africa, Latin America, and other places. And, states who are on the receiving end of that money or whatever will, if not be more sympathetic, will at least not be that critical of the country that the major power, that's a P5 member, and P5, one of the permanent fives, and who also happens to be a major economic power in the world. So that's where I see this going. But I also see China, even though it has found its reasserted place, and in the world, being selective on what principles it wants to push. It will push some principles of the UN, but those that during the Cold War were pushed by the other side, basically, and it's still there. It's the same international law principles that we had in 1945. We have to remember that. It's not that we have all of a sudden even though in the 1990s it seemed like that was the direction, it didn't happen. It didn't materialize. International law is what it is.
Thank you, Julie. Karl?
Well, I would just make a comment and come back to one point that Julie made. That the overriding issue, the eclipsing issue, in the long run will be climate change. And how the question is, if that is the case, how do we get to a corporate solution via the international cooperation via the UN? And you mentioned, Julie, also one of the fundamental problems in globalization, that apparently that is at least how many people in the developed world see it. There is on the one side a remarkable economic success of developing countries, notably China, with its kind of state capitalist model. And on the other hand, there is the suffering of the old working class, if you like, whose promises, whose expectations from their market-oriented economic system are badly frustrated in a world that grows in the way it does so far. So if we don't get a grasp on this problem, which basically underlies the rise of populism in countries like the United States or the UK and many continental European countries, it's very hard to see how we could get closer to our great global aims. So it's you know, liberals, as liberals, we are condemned to be optimistic, but at the moment it's really a little bit difficult. And you mentioned so nicely that at the 50th anniversary, there was a much more enthusiastic and optimistic spirit. And now we're sitting there, we see globalization going in a direction which apparently leaves behind the poor among the rich. It makes people, the poor, in the poor parts of the world richer on average, but with a strong concentration, as you said, on Asia and in China. But it in the last 20 years, we experienced that it makes the poorer part of societies in rich countries poorer, and inclined to right-wing populists, to follow right-wing populist ideas. I think we have to very much focus on this issue if we, well, apart from the organizational matters of the UN, really to work hard on an agenda which gets us out of this trap. I don't have a solution, but it's maybe the core issue of whether we can get back on the old positive trend that we in the world, that we combine global growth with more equality, more or less everywhere, or whether we fall into the trap of a more polarizing spirit, and not anymore between the developing world and the developed world, but mostly steered up and fired up by the anger of parts of society in the rich countries of the world. And the United States, well, Trump is no, sorry, but Trump is no accident. And even if we get rid of him in November, the sociology of American society is still roughly the same. And the sociology of our European societies is also staying as it is. So this is the core issue, maybe really the one eclipsing everything might be climate change, but behind that there is the deep split in our societies, which makes politics and international cooperation so difficult. Thank you.
Thank you, Karl. Lord John is asking for the floor. John, you have the floor.
Thank you very much indeed, Madam President. Thank you to our presenters. I want to put in a slightly different analysis. First of all, as far as the involvement of China is concerned, I'd like to remind colleagues of the difficulties we as Liberal International had with China quite some years ago, when the appearance of one of our colleagues from the DPP in Taiwan at the Human Rights Council, asking the question whether or not the DPP and Taiwan in particular could become part of the World Health Organization, led to Liberal International being expelled from the UN system for 12 months because China had control of the General Assembly. And although all the Western countries voted to maintain Liberal International's position, I spent the next number of months negotiating with Beijing to get LI back in again. So this business of China is not a new thing, and China is absolutely determined to have its way. This is the first thing. The second thing is that the question of climate change is an enormous problem, but I'm not convinced that it's the only key existential threat. I think war is absolutely a key existential threat. The UN was not set up to deal with poverty, wasn't set up to deal with climate change or any of these kinds of things. It was set up after the Second World War, as was the European project, to try to prevent another global conflict. That's what the first principle of the United Nations is. And frankly, I think it's lost its way in regard to that particular problem. We are currently already in a global conflict in cyberspace. And I don't see an awful lot being done to address that fact. I think one of the difficulties in some ways is that the UN has allowed itself to go on dealing with a whole series of other very important problems. But the fundamental purpose of, fundamental principle has not been getting the attention. And I don't hear it being said that we have this kind of conflict going on and the UN should be trying to deal with it. In fact, on the contrary, what has happened is that that conflict has infected the Security Council. And it is almost impossible to get anything worthwhile through the Security Council because of the veto of the P5. And when some of my liberal colleagues at home in the UK say, you know, we want more done at a global level, we want more done at a United Nations level, I say to them, hang on a second. The three key leaders in the United Nations are the presidents of Russia, China, and the United States of America. I personally don't want any of them, never mind all three of them, making any kinds of decisions that affect what I think about the world, because I'm completely opposed to the things they stand for. So I think liberals are in a very difficult position where they have lost the momentum and the agenda, and where the United Nations itself is no longer dealing with its fundamental problem. The other problems are very important. But if we find ourselves in a nuclear war before the end of this year, it's not entirely impossible at all. Just look what's happening between China and India, for example, which are nuclear powers. We could well find ourselves in a situation. I've been talking to some of our colleagues in India who say, thoughtful intellectuals. So I think we should be very cautious about not paying sufficient attention to the war and conflict problem in favor of attending only to other existential threats, hugely important as they are.
Thank you, John. Thank you. I think that Julie wants to comment. Julie?
Yes, yes. Thank you very much. No, I was listening to Karl and John. Now, John, I agree with you absolutely. You know, but you know, why has the UN been doing a lot of things which were needed, basically, in any case, because there was, you know, very little it could do on other matters, right? Whenever there's a threat of a veto, that something there's, you know, there's no decision. Even at the best moments in the 90s, when it seemed like after the Cold War that the UN was going to be a new thing, right, and that it was now going to be blocked by two camps, you know, always vetoing each other. We saw major failures. Like Rwanda is one of them, obviously, right? But others, you know, Yugoslavia, whatever we saw, it was very difficult for the UN to actually act in its primary purpose, which was to prevent war or conflict. However, I have to say, this said, if the UN had not been invented, it would be a great loss for the world, because it has done an immensely amount of good. And frankly, the conditions for the creation of the UN were those of 1945 and none other. I believe that at any other moment in time than after that amazing, crazy war that killed so many, and that, you know, really some countries came together, the winners of the war, basically to say, let's do this now, and let's do it better with more teeth than the League of Nations. Let's remember the failures of the League of Nations and how very little teeth the League of Nations had. At least they made something that can do things and can do certain things pretty well. So let's praise it for what it does well, and let's acknowledge you're right. You know, maybe it was too diplomatic with that, but you know, let's acknowledge that some things have not been done because they are structurally impossible or very difficult to do. Now, the threat of a nuclear war, it's true that I think since the end of the Cold War, we have put that in the kind of the back burner, and we think, well, but there's still like the arsenal of nuclear weapons is just immense. I mean, we can destroy the world over many, many times, and that should worry us, of course. However, because it's been quite a number of years, and because it seems that, you know, countries probably don't want to enter into that, and we hope that they won't, because if they do, we're cooked, as cooked as we were in the time of the Cold War, for those who remember that time, if something had happened. We have to concentrate on others. And I think climate change, at least for me, I am convinced that it's going to be at one point so unsufferable, you know, for many countries or whatever, that it's going to be like, what did we do all these years? Why didn't we really work a little bit more on this? Because it's really changed. I see it with my own eyes. You know, I teach in California. I see all those fires happening, you know, around, you know, in a major way. You know, just had a friend who texted me, who was in some place in California, and she said, you know, some people had just lit a fire with celebrating some kind of like gender reveal of their baby, you know, it's a boy or a girl, and then they had, you know, things like that, you know, and then it's a massive fire, hundreds and hundreds of hectares in Spain. Huge fires have happened in the past decade in Spain, for example, and many other areas in Europe. It's and that's just, you know, the tip of the iceberg. All these poor islands, you know, who are going to be flooded in just a few years. But many coastal areas in 50, 70 years, I do worry very much, if we are alive. You know, if there's no nuclear war before that, as you say, John. And we don't want to be here extremely pessimistic, obviously not. But still, you know, it is a reality that if we compare to 100 years ago, things could happen, but at least we knew that the world could not be destroyed by our own arms. A lot of damage could be done. Now we know it can be done in a major, major way, and the arsenals are there, and some poorly guarded, I have to say. You know, there's a huge worry about that, and where nuclear weapon is going to pop up, when and where it's going to pop up someday. Sorry, just wanted to react to that. And Karl, I agree with everything you said as well. So there we go.
Thank you, Julie. I agree with both of you, John and Julie, and I can tell you that many conflicts are already recorded because of climate change, and the IPCC has registered or has counted more than 135 conflict because of climate change, and in its report it says that in 2050 the most important flow of migration will be because of climate change, and it will be 250 million in 2000 migrants in 2050. But I agree with John that preventing conflict and war is one of the pillar or action of the UN. Now, hopefully, UN is taking care of SDGs and climate change with a lot of difficulties, I can tell you. And I just to complete the answers you have given to Astrid, I was participating in many conventions in UN, and I can tell you the one of Sunday action, the one of the SDGs, the one of climate change, the biodiversity, soil degradation, and I can tell you that Chinese are playing a major role in all the discussions and the decisions. And we used to have the presence of United States, which was countering the weight of China. Less and less these last few years, the United States is represented during the convention, but they are not so active and they are not playing the role they used to play in all the conventions. So I think that the involvement of United States within the United Nations is very important and will allow us to have this equilibrium, to have this balance between to counterbalance the power of the Chinese in all the negotiations. This is just my feeling and how I already experienced this together with the Americans and Chinese in those conventions where I was playing a role as a UN envoy. I will now tell you that as we are not we are few, so I think that we can continue the discussion on the big group, and I don't think to split on smaller group is necessary. We are maybe 10 person and we can manage it like that. This is my proposal to you. And I'm really sorry I have to leave you because we have to travel. I'm in holiday and they are waiting for me. So I will leave and maybe hand over the floor to Astrid to continue sharing this meeting. Astrid, are you here? Do you want to do that, please? Astrid, do you hear me?
Yes, I hear you, and I wish you safe travels. So
thank you,
yeah,
thank you, and thank you for your participation. Thank you, Pierre, for your very useful and interesting presentation. Thank you, Julie, and wish you a very good continuation of this discussion, and stay healthy and safe.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So dear, yes, Hakima, stay healthy and safe.
Bye-bye.
Safe travels. Just please, I mean, as we have this chat function, or you could raise your hand to have the floor. We have many participants who have not yet spoken. You are very welcome to do that. And while you are thinking of questions, I put a question here, which has been in the conversation, which has been I have been struggling with because exactly when Karl-Heinz spoke about, let's say, raising inequality and the parts of society polarized in the, let's say, so-called developed world, are we together as internationalists doing much enough to stop tax evasion? Because that has been for some time that hinders the financing, for instance, of good education or health systems in the developed world. I put that question to us because I think it's part also of the financing and having equality around the world. And the second one, which is of course not as much on the agenda as when I was a young person and remember discussions about development, and that is of course, you know, is it all allowed to talk about population planning? Because there's always that difficult balance between who is let's say, whose footprint on Earth is worse. We with the Western world with a high consumption, but hoping to have the new circular economy and less use of natural resources, or is it the population growth that puts then some societies into? And where is that discussion? I would put a question to Per and to Juli, especially because that was also part of, you know, what would you like to see the international community and UN turning 100? We have okay, population changes, but population grows and population planning. We know there is an attack and there is, let's say, forces aligned with the Catholic Church and some other non-Christian, but some Muslim societies, all together banning anything that would be the word gender or the let's say, the right of the woman to decide herself on those things. So there's also a backlash, which I think has environmental consequences, and then maybe not to say about security consequences, but where is that conversation? What should we do about to raise that? Maybe Per could answer, maybe Juli could think about that. And please, Darren, I see that Darren in Cape Town is also here. We would like to hear your contribution from the south of the planet, and it will be very interesting. Darren, I invite you also to take the floor if you have some wishes. But first, Per and Juli.
Thank you, Astrid, and please forgive me if I in 10-15 minutes have to leave you. Extremely privileged to be part of the conversation. I will touch on the demographics. I just wanted to make a quick comment back on the question raised on deepening inequalities across the world and what it makes, the effects it has. My comment is, in the SDGs, we have a dimension of universality that is not yet tapped into. We believe still that the SDGs is a priority of the so-called developed world, but it's an agenda for all of us. And in countries like Kenya, pegged on the constitution, there is a plan, a Vision 2030 plan for shared prosperity. So when the election comes on, political parties compete on who will deliver that plan for shared prosperity. But in Sweden, there is no such plan. So I believe that when I met the SG and we planned for the conference, anti-terrorist conference last year in Kenya, he admitted that in the pro-poor strategies, we have focused on poor population where demographic are the most dense, because we wanted to make the most impact on poverty. But radicalization and terrorism have been growing of the feeling of sense of exclusion, and that cuts across rich nations and poor nations. So we need a blueprint vision that goes across political parties and into the future, and the SDGs national plans could be such. Now over to the demographic dividend. In the 1950s, the population of Sweden and the population of Kenya was the same, 7 million. Today, Sweden has 10 million and Kenya has 50 million. In 2050, Kenya's population will be 100 million. Now, the average age of the population sub-Sahara is around 17 years, and in Sweden now 43 years. So you have to grow rich before you grow old, if you put it bluntly. These are the demographic push. It's also important to remember that when the Asian tigers took off, they were at the demographic, the youth bulk was at the demographic level of where Africa is today. So the question is, what are the investments that Africa need to do to reap the benefits of the demographic dividend at this point, and by doing so increase livelihood dividends to the population that could counter the arguments for having large families. When you get into the countryside and you meet people that have absolutely nothing in terms of securities or resources that go beyond a week, it's very difficult to argue with them that they should have 2 or 3 children instead of 7 and 8. So you have to tie the issue of the demographics into socio-economic transformation, and that comes back into in the visibility of SDGs. You have to connect security with livelihood creation, investment in development, and I'm still positive that we are actually moving those insights forward. But the big challenge here is that youth in rich homes and in poor homes, they don't feel included in that conversation.
Thank you. And Juli.
Yes, thank you. I was just, now verifying that what I remembered was correct, and it is. The Pope, since you mentioned Catholics, the Pope, Pope Francis did say that in order to abide by the mandates on the capacity to procreate, people did not need to breed like rabbits. That was his quote, and that was what Pope Francis said. So there maybe is some kind of evolution also in at the top, at least of the leadership of the Catholic Church, on realizing, on the one hand, the mandate they feel that God has given humans to populate the earth, and on the other hand, the fact that people need to be careful, because otherwise we're going to have a very populated planet. I mean, in 1950, when the United Nations was at the beginning, there were between 2 and 3 billion people, and now we are at over 7, right? And by the year 2100, the prospect is about 11 billion people on planet Earth, right? So 9 point something by the middle of the century in 2050. Now, these are huge numbers, and it's not only the worry about feeding them or whatever. This is an old worry, right? I mean, that all those fears were never realized. And we probably feed all these people, depending on how we evolve in agriculture or whatever. But it's also like more complex for the management of the resources of the planet in terms of the exploitation of the environment and all those things. We want all those goals on the one hand, and then we are like, having 11 billion people. It's unprecedented in this planet. Something will have to give. So now the UN on this, right? I mean, since the 1994 conference on population, remember, there hasn't been as much of an outcry about population. It's not really, well, I mean, I'm probably going to be contradicted, but it's not on the radar as one of the major issues yet. Of course, it affects a lot of the development goals, on migration, on a lot of things. It also shows an imbalance in the world. Europe is retreating in terms of population. Africa is increasing. Asia, the huge growth in Asia. And we have to see how these trends go. It is a major problem, and maybe it is about time that there's a major push again at the UN on this issue. So thank you, I think, Astrid, for remarking it. That it might be something. Of course, there are all these issues that have to do with ideology that might, pose some problems or roadblocks or whatever, and they do, because governments are political, and some particular big countries changed from one administration to the next almost night and day on this particular issue. So it's complicated. Now on tax evasion, of course, the big, I think, or the way I saw it was that the big change was after the terrorist attacks in the 2000s, because all of a sudden people realized, well, it's not only some people getting wealthier by avoiding taxes, it's like financing for terrorism, right? And there's a lot, if you have opacity, that opacity doesn't help. Basically doesn't help a lot of other goals we have, which is to fight against organized crime and to fight against terrorism. So there's been a big push, a huge push. And in fact, in Europe, for example, most tax havens as such, are gone or are soon to be gone, because the rules and the procedures are such right now that now there's still in other parts of the world, practices there maybe are not as the ones we would like, in banking and other issues. Now, we'll see how this evolves. I had an interesting conversation years ago in a visit to the UK about tax issues with your minister in the UK, and I'm actually interested in seeing and I don't know, but maybe you can address that. Is there an issue that is being discussed in the UN with the Brexit negotiations or whatever? What's going to happen to the tax system in the UK? Is there you read about some politicians who are arguing for reduced taxes in the UK to be more competitive in the world and whatnot. That is actually a legitimate thing, right? I mean, and I think as a liberal, I don't think high taxes are particularly the best unless they are managed in the best way possible. However, there is a sense, and I think now we all share it, that tax evasion is a thing that should be of the past. Tax evasion and whatever things, people should be able to move, people should be able to plan their lives, the way they want, but there should be transparency, cooperation, and no, levels of opacity that allow, organized crime and terrorism to just, finance their activities without any problem. Now, a lot of, by the way, we put sometimes the light on the so-called tax havens, but a lot of tax evasion happens in a lot of bigger countries. Let's remember that. And there are major countries in the world where it's very easy to just open an account and go unmonitored for many years. So there.
Okay. Was Darren interested in taking the floor and tell us a little bit? Yes, please, Darren.
Astrid, thanks very much. I won't use my video because of the bandwidth in South Africa at the moment with load shedding. But just to say that we've had a few interesting conversations of late with regards to both terrorism and the UN reform. And a lot of it has to do with the fact that South Africa itself wants to reform the UN in terms of representation. We have an arrogance about ourselves where we believe that Africa needs to be more represented in the UN. And I think we fight a lot more for the Eastern countries to be more represented. My party itself being more of the liberal, from the liberal side, as you know, we have many sister parties within the Liberal International. We've had many discussions on liberal reform within the UN ourselves because we believe that it's becoming more political, that there's a lot of political fights that are taking place in the UN. Now, an interesting conversation took place yesterday with regards to terrorism, which is quite interesting to the topic here, in that Mozambique has a terrorism infiltration, which started out about 6 years ago, which came from East Africa, and it was mainly due to unemployment. It was not actually an ideology. It was more an unemployment, and it became more territorial. And now there's a gas line where in France, the Total is involved, the company Total. And now the terrorism has actually aligned to terrorist organizations abroad. And now the terrorism is actually festered into more broad-based terrorism itself, which now we're seeing more international interest. Unfortunately, now it's given a lot more recruitment to have taken place. And now, listening to people speaking on the fact that in Africa, where we've had, we talk about unemployment, we talk about aid. Our problems aren't that. Our problem is we need to find ways in which we can trade and become equal trading partners, as I always say, with the Europes, with the Americas, with the Asias, is finding ways in which we can, and I've always raised the example of when we bring a container from China or from Europe to Africa, you can land it in Kenya. It will cost you about $600 to get there, but then move it anywhere from Kenya, anywhere into Africa. You can move it to the next country. You can move it down south. You can move it down west or north, anywhere. And it's $1,600 minimum. So it's already more just to move it to the next country. It will cost you way more than what it would have cost you to ship it from any of the other continents. And that's the problem within our infrastructure. Now, China and Russia have already seen Africa and the potential in Africa to exploit the resources of Africa, and have already started obviously building the Silk Road, the Silk Highway, They're already looking at nuclear power for opportunities. So what I call it is the next colonialism. And unfortunately for us, I don't think the UN has got any teeth to see what's really going on here. So we've got terrorism on the one hand, but we've got exploitation taking place on the other hand. And, you know, the UN itself, they can't see what's happening on the human rights atrocities. And you remember at Liberal International, I presented that paper on the African free trade, on our free trade agreement, where I showed and proved the human rights atrocities that can take place on a free trade agreement when you have countries that have versus countries that have not on the same continent. So what we're sitting with in Africa is a land that is rich in resources, but is also ripe for the picking. As much as it wants to get away from a colonial past, is about to repeat its own history by allowing continents to pick it up and exploit it again. So now, I've been involved in what's called the Normandy peace process and the peace program, and we've been looking at ways for the UN to reform itself. And that's why I found this topic quite interesting for me, is because we're looking at a checklist, a broad-based checklist. When the UN does their fact-finding missions, they have a habit of landing, doing a quick peacekeeping or a quick monitoring or review, and then, you know, coming and reporting, and that's the story. And what happens is often, we know the saying that there's two sides to the story, but usually there's three sides to the story. Now, in a conflict, what seems to happen is that the one side, he who shouts the loudest seems to get listened to, or he who raises the alarm first seems to always be the innocent or the victim. And that seems to be the pattern within the UN. And I think what we need to create in the UN is almost like a checklist, a balanced scorecard where we say, right, we have to approach this side of the party and we have to approach that side. We have to, both envoys have to get filled out this type of report. Both reports have to be available to anyone to be able to peruse. Both reports have to be able to, you know, and both resources are both countries or parties have the resources to be able to have, you know, the media or the presentations created that can show both sides of what their conflict is or why there is conflict. You know, it's just being able to both fairly give their sides of the story or why in their minds the conflict took place. Just by going through the conflicts that are taking place currently, just in the Middle East, just in Ukraine, in Taiwan and Hong Kong, we're already seeing a pattern of how these two or three stories and how the UN are fudging on how to proceed, where you've got countries chairing the UN Human Rights Council that quite frankly in their own countries can't practice human rights. So there's already a problem. You've then got the UN that maybe it's time that the UN forms a parliament where all countries can actually sit in on that parliament itself and have the same amount of representation. So you can still have the superpowers might still have the right to veto, but that you still have you have equal representation. Let's say in Parliament, you have this UN Parliament. So I just wanted to give that input, if I may. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And let me really say that what you said also about the parliamentary dimension was, I saw that was in social media around this discussion, asking because where is our initiative around UN parliamentary dimension? Of course, a little bit more traditional maybe than what you mentioned. So Darren put questions, and Juli or Karl-Heinz, would you like to answer? Let me say that we have some 7 minutes left. I will not do any wrap up of this because we have good note takers and we have with interest noted the draft declaration that Juli was mentioning, and there are many things we can support in that. I think the challenge for us will be to make it lively, to make it workable. There is one thing in this draft declaration Juli mentioned that I also wanted to say, and those are those digital divides and equal resources, equal access to digitalization. Question that is very much on the agenda as well in our own human rights committee. And today we see figures like we are maybe sometimes believing that Africa is most behind, but actually South America has a very, very low penetration. And we know with that also divided atmosphere. But Julie, Karl-Heinz, anybody else before we have to close? And also wanted to say, that what you said, Darren, about prevention is of course very, very worthwhile and will be noted in our notes. So maybe Julie first. And indicate if anybody you want to have the floor.
Yes, thank you very much. I mean, I think one of our responses need to be informed by what we agreed in the manifesto in 2017. I think that's important because there's a lot of things that sometimes one doesn't reread those important texts, and then rereading the manifesto in these circumstances nowadays, I just thought, well, we did a relatively good job, and I don't want to just say that because it was a very collective work, and it was a lot of work. I mean, Karl-Heinz, of course, is the main person, but it was a lot of input from many different positions of liberalism, and I think we came with an idea of where we should go. The other thing is, we have debated here today about some countries that offer some models or whatever. I mean, the big game changer, of course, one of the big game changers would be if China, which is a country that has developed, and frankly, sometimes you would think, well, are you saying this because China? I love China. I've been there a number of times. I admire the culture of the Chinese and the philosophy and many issues that are amazing about the country. But if the country, rather than having a regime that's not accountable to the people, had like an evolution towards democracy, this would be a big game changer in the world, and which absolutely would really change the way. It wouldn't mean that China would not look out for its interests. Each state in the world of sovereign states has to and looks out for its own interests, of course, and that of its population, but it would do so in a way that would be more conducive to multilateralism, probably, and whatnot, because China is multilateral, but in a very particular way. Right, and asserting, I'm being diplomatic here, but in one that actually makes sure that it doesn't touch upon its regime, and that's a bit sad, I think, because China has so much more to offer the world, and so much more to contribute to civilization, like it has done throughout its history for thousands and thousands of years. The other thing that I probably would come out of this meeting is I think that it was good for John to remind us that the security part of the UN, which we don't sometimes allude to because of the limitations through the difficulty of taking decisions on that matter, is still central, and there's still a big danger there. I think that's important to remember. The nuclear danger is there. Just because it's there and we don't have the Cold War anymore, it doesn't seem as pressing until something happens, and it might happen. With a population by the end of the century of 11 billion people, and God knows, we're going to have conflicts that we cannot even imagine this time. But I still maintain and I still believe that climate change is going to be the major issue because we have it upon ourselves, and it's going to be of such urgency at one point. I think it's going to be a tipping point. It's not going to be one of those things that there's going to be a moment in which it's going to be really, really difficult for everybody. It's going to affect every country. And that's, even it's total chaos. But I hope, because I see, when we've reached the limits of our capabilities and our horror possibilities as human beings, we normally retreat from the edge, and we normally take decisions as important as the ones that were taken in San Francisco in 1945 when the United Nations was created. And we are celebrating 75 years. We should celebrate it, because the world is much better with having had the multilateral system, as imperfect as it is, as bound as it is to the member states of the UN, and et cetera, and as disappointed as we can be of the Human Rights Council or other institutions that we think we should have another role or should do more things. But it's still quite amazing if we look at the world before 1945 and the world now in terms of international law, in terms of a structure in the world, in sort of goals and things that, as much as many states can criticize, they cannot really avoid having a kind of measure there, right? We have a measure. At least we can measure what doesn't go well. So that's basically, I think, my summary of the whole thing. Thank you.
Well, I may. You asked me just a few concluding words from my side. I think we should not really put up these hierarchies of aims. I think we have a whole lot of fundamental, structurally very different problems. As to the environment and climate change, we have a creeping problem, which in the long run may have extremely serious consequences. But at the same time, we have, and we tend to overlook, the potential for massive conflicts. And this potential has increased in recent years to a degree that we did not expect 30 years ago, or at the 50th anniversary of the UN, and that has a lot to do with the rise of China as on the one side, state capitalist power, and on the other side, an enormously powerful country who doesn't really give a damn for human rights, and that is a fundamental shock to all our concepts that we shared of a genuine form of multilateralism. The same with Russia. Please don't forget what Russia is doing at the moment. It's simply unbelievable. It undercuts all standards that we had hoped for. So we have, and at the same time, we have the third problem that I mentioned, which is the drifting apart of the societies of the richer and more democratic parts of the world, which then feeds populism. So we have construction sites everywhere, and I think we liberals have to look very carefully what tools we use. Astrid, I perfectly agree that tax evasion is a major problem. But I do not know whether it's the core problem with respect to getting back onto a track of inclusive growth in our societies. There, I would much more look at education and the proper forms of education. And so we have challenges everywhere. And we need an encompassing state who gives opportunities to everybody. And this is all formulated in the manifesto, in which we should continue to fill our general outlines or our general strategies with a more concrete flesh. Finally, I would perfectly agree with you, Juli. We have to prevent ourselves from getting pessimistic, because whatever we say about Russia, whatever we say about China, whatever we say about Trump's America, look back into the past. I remember the Soviet Union where nobody could express his opinion, and there were two dissidents. The one was Solzhenitsyn, and the other was Sakharov. We knew them by names, and all others were sitting in the gulag. You know, today, go to Moscow, go to St. Petersburg, and there are millions of people in these two cities alone who criticize Putin on the net. Well, it doesn't really help so far to prevent Putin, the old Secret Service man, of doing what he does. But at least we have a much pluralistic society, even in Russia. And we have a much pluralistic society, or elements of it, in China. We had it in Hong Kong. It's threatened, and it's a big problem. And our Taiwanese friends feel, of course, threatened, and rightly so, by the behavior of China. And in America, we have Trump, but we have a vivid and lively civil society and a stable democracy for a very long time. So, I mean, we have to put things into perspective, and this gives one encouragement, I think, not to give up and not to become fatalistic pessimists. This is not a nice attitude for liberals. Thank you.
Thank you, Karl-Heinz. Susanna has asked for the floor. So please, are you still online?
Yes, I'm still here. I just
sorry, my device did not show who was asking for the floor.
No worries. I want to thank you for the presentation. They were very enlightening, and I'm really enjoying this conversation. I just want to. I was thinking on the dichotomies of the future we want and the future we need, and also the UN that we have and the UN that we dream of. And I was reclaiming back in 2012 at the time of the UN Conference on Sustainable Development in Rio, that the member states in the Future We Want resolution reaffirmed the need to achieve sustainable development, and they commit to work together to promote sustainable development. They to achieve sustainable development by promoting inclusive and equitable economic growth. And with this limited resources that we have, this growing population, conflicts, I was thinking, and this is something I wanted to ask you, if the international community, the UN, didn't lose an opportunity of rethinking how to achieve this sustainable development rather than like with sustained economic growth. This is one thing that I want to ask you. And the other thing, and this is linking what Hakima said about non-state actors. And I believe that if we want to, or if UN should share or have a shared and common universal agenda, and want to really achieve that agenda, should include more actors, as Hakima said, and have really open up for a really multi-actor and multi-level governance, and also include it. And I believe this is really quite important, because I believe we can consider ourselves as governmental stakeholders, either because we hold we have members in the parliaments, or we have people elected in local and regional governments. So we can say that besides being part of member states' governments, we are governmental stakeholders. And also, if we had to discuss about this, what the kind of UN reform we want and what principles should be included, I believe that we should include policy coherence, coordination, and cooperation at all levels. Thank you.
Thank you for the comments. Do anybody want to continue here? Would you like to comment, Juli?
No. Unfortunately, I have an appointment, another web appointment these days. You know, there are many in 10 minutes. But you know, I appreciate it, and anybody that would like to maybe offer some all the comments in the meeting chat, I think would be great, because we could use them then when the LA Secretariat finalizes the report. I think it's important to prepare a report, and I think it's important to send that report to the UN through our consultative status and also through our parliamentary networks and other networks of politicians, so that they know that we've been thinking, not only in this session, which is a kind of session that tries to see a little bit more the trees in the forest, but also like through some reflections that have been going on, and of course also from an extension of the manifesto.
Yeah, thank you, Juli, because I think it's your intervention, in addition to also, looking at the Andorra manifesto, can well complement the report that is going to be written, because that was the idea, that we would have note takers that would put things down. And I would just maybe on my personal note wanted to make one plea, which has been disturbing very much, because we are criticizing the Human Rights Council and it's not fulfilling the expectation. But still, as long as we have possibilities to hear countries and to hear the situation, the special rapporteurs, we get the first signs of alarm where a conflict can break out. And there's been sometimes said that there's too long way between the UN entities in Geneva, where you have the more humanitarian parts of UN, and the hard core in New York. And let's say at least like-minded countries should follow much more clearly and thoroughly what is coming up as electoral, let's say, violences after elections. There's often a sign that something is going to happen. We see it with our friends in Guinea, in Western Africa, in different parts of the world. So that is something that I really would like to also mention. And clearly, the reports that are made for Human Rights Council, they are an important source for all the private actors that want to take human rights into account in trade relations. That is something, the consumer power is growing and the municipal power is growing. So you have the balance that the world is different from 45, when you have new actors that need to work together with the UN. That's something I would like to take into account when I thank you all for participating and for being patient that we now, let's say, switched chair here in the middle of the session. And let me, last but not least, before I thank all of you for the participation, note that while we were discussing, I think in the emails and inboxes and tweets of many of us came news about harassment of elected persons in three different regions of Russia, of Yabloko representatives. So that has also been taking place. That is more of the same pattern of Navalny, infiltration in Belarus, and now also attacking Yabloko. And we also have heard, that, let's say, the last free person of the opposition council of Belarus, the Nobel laureate, she has also been harassed. She has asked for interrogation, and here we can see that some ambassadors and diplomats are trying to protect her at this point. So I can just assure you that we continue also to spread information and show the solidarity with our friends in Russia and in Belarus and all other places where it is needed. So thank you, and now it will be the task of our good secretariat, who has put a lot of effort also into this meeting. Thank you, Michaela. Thank you, Caspar. Thank you, Jason. Those of you who are with us, for the effort and for the initiative, because it was an initiative of our young secretariat to do this session and to raise our voice inside the UN. Thank you to all of you, and good meetings or good sessions, whatever. See you soon on this media. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Thank you.